What's up, guys? It's your boy Krisztian back at it again with another video, and today we are talking about sound design. So in today's video, we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of sound design and using it in your videos. Then we're going to break down the sniper B-roll sequence and kind of the sound design that I used in that video. And then throughout the whole video, I'm going to share 3 different tips that I use for when I do sound design in my videos and kind of my thought process around it all. So I recently put out a video titled Cinematic Sniper B-roll. And in that video, it was all based around sound design. I used no music, just sound effects. And the whole point of the video was because for a while now, I've wanted to make a video entirely based around sound design, but I just haven't really found the perfect video. And I thought that that setting and that video was perfect, you know, running through the forest, having that suspense. I don't think I've actually made like a suspenseful video or any kind of video that would have some sort of thriller / suspense. So that was also a big inspiration and a lot of fun throughout the video to do that kind of mood and set the tone. Essentially, the mood for the video was just a man running through the forest, running away from something. We don't know what he's running from, where he's going, or why he's doing all of that. We just know that he's trying to get away from something. The inspiration behind that was the first Jaws movie, where you really don't see the shark throughout the whole movie. You maybe see him like 4 times, maybe less. It's been a while since I've watched it. But the whole point of that, it builds up even more suspense because you don't see the bad guy, right? You just think that he's lurking in the shadows. You don't know if he's there. He might be there. He might not be. But that's the whole point. The whole point is that there's that suspense because you don't see him that often. Another good example is The Babadook. That's another really good horror movie that kind of builds that suspense by not seeing what's actually there until the very end. But in the end, it's just me trying to flex my sound design skills and just try and challenge myself with something new. So firstly, the importance of sound design. Adding sound to your videos is huge. Like if you're not adding sound effects to your videos now, whether it's client or personal or whatever it may be, you have to start adding it. Because sound is literally 50% of the video, right? It's visual and auditory. Those are the 2 things that we can use as filmmakers and creators to get our mood and image across to the audience. So here's a little example that might make it a little bit easier to understand the importance of sound design. So take these 2 different locations and imagine being there. First location is a coffee shop in the capital city of your country on a Saturday morning in a beautiful summer day. And the second scenario is you're in your bed on a Tuesday night during the middle of the winter. Now, if you just imagine yourself in those 2 scenarios, maybe the things that stick out to you are obviously the first thing is the visual, right? Like where you are. If you're in the cafe, bright colors, it's a bright day, it's a city, there's a ton of stuff happening, ton of stuff moving. And then if you think about the second scenario when you're at night, almost nothing's happening, probably very dark, maybe blue because it's winter, you get the reflection from the moonlight, things like that. They're very, very different scenarios. So now that you got the visuals down, think about the audio in those 2 scenarios, right? You're at the coffee shop. What do you hear? You hear the city, you hear cars driving by, you hear people passing by, you hear people talking as they're passing by, you hear people in the coffee shop, you hear the clicking and clanking of cups in the coffee shop. You hear a ton of different sound effects while you're there in such a busy environment. Then go to scenario number 2. When you're in your bed in the middle of the winter, what do you hear? Almost nothing, right? It's like eerily quiet. Maybe you hear the wind. Maybe you hear the frost on the window. There's a ton of different small sound effects that you could hear in the second scenario that you would never ever hear in the first scenario because they're so contrasting locations and environments. The different mood and environment between the 2 locations is what makes sound design so crucial for your videos, right? So if you're at the coffee shop and you have a scene there, you're going to include all those sound effects of the world around you and all those things that are happening. Whereas when you're in your bedroom at night, you're going to include a lot less sound effects and a lot more eerie sound effects and a lot more distinctive sound effects because it's so quiet. So the point essentially that I'm trying to make is that each environment and each mood that you're creating for that environment has different sound effects, right? Like if you're at the coffee shop, but let's say you're trying to give some bad news, very dramatic, you would change that up, right? You'd probably do what they do in the movies and like fade the outside noise and kind of focus on what you're trying to accentuate, whether it's a person talking to your character, something that's happening on the table, something else that they're looking at. You're gonna alter the sound effects in that environment to create your mood. The other sound effects don't go away, but they're just not as accentuated as maybe the ones that you'd want to. if that makes sense. So key point, sound design shapes the environment around us and lets us use it in a way to create a proper mood and ambiance to the videos that we create. So let's actually get into the sequence and break it down. Okay, so to get into the breakdown, the video starts with 3 different drone shots. And those were kind of just used essentially to kind of set the scene. I thought it might be a little bit too jarring and too much to just get right into these shots of my dad running. So I kind of needed something to build up the tone and the suspense a little bit. Even though there's not like very suspenseful shots, I just needed something to kind of fill the air a little bit. And they look pretty cool too. So I thought I'd use all these different drone shots. Actually, like this one was filmed like 2 weeks ago, whereas these 2 were filmed way back in May. Also, if you didn't know, these are fake clouds that I added as well. So let's actually talk about the different steps that I used in creating a video like this that's basically totally sound design. So the first thing I did was I put in all the video clips that I wanted and I arranged them in the way that I wanted them. Because typically in a video, I'll base the video clips around music, but since we're not using music in this video, there wasn't something like that I could base off of. And I knew that since it was kind of story-esque, not like a highlight reel of an event or a location or something like that, I knew that like, yes, this clip had to go before this clip and this clip had to go here, and this is the sequence that the video is gonna go into. So essentially I knew, okay, I have to add all these clips in, and then I speed ramped them, changed them up exactly to the way I wanted them. And I had all the video essentially set in, and then I started doing the sound design. So I had all my visuals in, and then I started kind of creating the first few layers of sound design. I put in a few different things at the start to see how it would feel, but for the most part, I made sure that I had all the video clips in there before I started the sound design process. So once I had all the video clips in there, what I did was I created essentially like a fundamental layer of atmospheres. That's what these first like 4, even this 5th layer does a little bit of, is it's just creating atmospheres through different Atmos sound effects. Essentially what that let me do is it created like a fundamental base layer that I was able to base all the other sound effects off of and more of the video off of. And even then, once I kind of had those in set, I was able to change some of the video speed ramps for the mood to kind of match the sound effects a little bit more. So essentially the second step was creating a baseline of atmospheres. And this is what they sound like. You got that initial one, then you have this like eerier one. And then later in the latter half of the video, this is kind of what multiple atmospheres playing together sounds like. It's just like 4 different like drones / atmospheres working together to kind of build suspense within the video. That let me get essentially a baseline. The next thing I added was I wanted to add some sort of like drum to it. And that's what this clip here is. It's essentially just like a dun dun. My thought process behind this was essentially when you hear that dun dun dun, it goes back to the Jaws thing that I had the original inspo from. But the whole point of that sound was when my dad is running away from something, it's playing. Like at the beginning here during the drones, very quiet, you can't hear it almost at all. And then once it gets to here, while he's running, it gets a little bit louder. Here it gets loud, and then it stays at the proper volume, right? Like just right about here. And then it kind of fades out, and then when he pulls his rifle up, it's quiet with all the different sound effects, and then when he starts running again, it comes back. And then it stops, when he raises the rifle for the second time here. So essentially, my thought process for something like that was I just wanted that sound effect to be there while he was running, to kind of have that sound effect be the sound that was like, okay, when he's being chased, that's what's playing, to kind of give that subconscious feeling. So essentially at that point, the third step would be adding the sound effects that I know are going to be in the video, right? So we have the video layers in, we have the fundamental sound effects in. At this point, we're going to add the sounds that I know are going to be in the video, right? So footsteps, that's definitely going to be in the video. You know, him loading the rifle, that's going to be another part of the video. The Foley of his jacket and rifle running, that's going to also be in the video. All the extra sound effects, I'm not worried about that at this point yet. I'm just putting in the sound effects that I know, okay, yeah, what you see, that's what you're going to feel and get. That's the next step. So adding all the different sound effects like the footsteps, the gravel, the grass, all that stuff. That was the next step. Then essentially at the same time, you know what you want in and what the sound effects that I know are going to need to be in the video. Then I figure out where I don't want sound effects, right? So you know where you want and don't want sound effects. I knew I didn't want sound effects at this part when he raised the rifle because I wanted to create that suspense. Right after he raised it, got really loud at around this portion here, and then he raised it and it just kind of went a little bit more quiet. I added a wind blowing sound effect and it created a little bit more suspense. So I knew at that part I didn't want any sound. Similarly to here, when he gets into the rifle scope, I didn't want much sound here too because I wanted to create suspense. I knew exactly which sound effects needed to be in the video and where I didn't want sound effects, and that was, I think, that's step 3, I think. Yeah, that's step 3. Know where you want sound effects and where you don't, and put those in respectively. So essentially, once you have the first 3 steps down, right, you have your visuals, you have your fundamental layers of sound effects and kind of what you want to base your video off of. Then you know exactly what sounds you want to add and have added those, and haven't added the parts where you don't want sounds to be. Then you can start adding the ancillary sound effects that kind of create more of the atmosphere of the video. So right here, for example, when my dad turns around, I added that like sound effect like this to kind of give that like, oh, is there something behind me? Let me check, whatever it may be. I started adding all those different ones. Then, for example, here where I didn't want sound effects, I added like a wind and a breathing sound, right? To give that like kind of like relaxation, if that makes sense. So the next part essentially is where he lowers the rifle here. You thought that when he raised the rifle, he was gonna see whatever was hunting him, but unfortunately you didn't. So here where he lowers the rifle, it's that like fuck, like, you know, he's lowering it and he knows that this is not over yet, right? Like that second wind, if that makes sense. So I added like a boom here when he lowers the rifle, and it kind of gives that like going down but swooping back up sound effect mood to the video. With that like it kind of like recreates that mood and it sets it back to the chase, right? Like it's almost like a little bit of a reset, if that makes sense. And then it goes back into intense running, as intense as it really is. So that's a bit of an example on how you can add sound to your videos to create a mood and a flow. You essentially can use sound effects to kind of make your video flow more like a dance, right? Because that's what makes video cinematic, is everything kind of flowing together, right? Like if you just have highlight reels and shit coming up on the screen, it's not going to be very flow and cinematic. But if it flows well and it moves with the movement, if the sounds move with the video even more, it'll just feel even more cinematic and it'll feel even more immersive as the viewer watches it. So this brings us to our first tip of the video, and that is to add all the small detail sound effects to the video to make it even more immersive. So for example, like I mentioned, when you run with a rifle, the sling of the rifle and all of it, it kind of moves, right? Like it's not sturdy in place. So you hear like a moving sound. This is what it sounds like. I recorded this myself. Right, so you have that sound, like essentially the rifle is hitting the jacket and it's moving, and it kind of just adds to the video. Like on its own, you're like, oh, that sounds too intense, too whatever. But when it fits with all these other sounds and you hear stepping and all that, it just kind of adds more to the pie. The next little detail that I kind of added throughout the video were these little kind of clothing follies when he moves the rifle. So right here, he puts the rifle down. So you have that sound effect. And then here is the sound effect of, it's like technically a footstep, but it was the sound where the rifle butt hits the ground. So that kind of like sounds like this. So the next kind of small sound effects is when he opens the ammo pouch here. You can hear the unclipping and the movement of the flap in the ammo pouch, right? It sounds a little bit intense when you just solo the track, but when it goes with the different atmospheres and you have all those sounds at the same time, it fits in nice, right? It doesn't feel too overwhelming. Hopefully this makes sense, right? You want to add as many of the sound effects as you can that you would think would happen throughout the video, right? So like the clothing foley, the wind, the birds, nature, you know, breathing like I added at one point. I think it's like right here. Yeah. Right? There's like breathing. Like, I don't know if you can hear that, but it just kind of adds to it. You just hear that like throughout the video, and it gives it more depth because he is running. And then obviously here where he hits the ground, you have a thud. All right, it's this one. You're like, oh, that doesn't even sound, that sounds like a, it doesn't sound like it, but it fits, right? Maybe, no, I added a little, I didn't even add bass to it. I added the bass effect, but didn't add any. So it's essentially stock. Some sound effects, you can add parametric equalizers and treble and all that, or you can, you know, pitch shift them to sound different. And I did do that to a lot of the sounds throughout the video, but sometimes it's better just to go with the stock sound. So tip 1, make sure you add all the small sound effects throughout the video. It'll make it even more immersive for the video. So this goes to the second tip, which is make sure that the sound effects that you're adding actually sound like they're in the environment where you are. Right? You want to have all these different sound effects feel like they're in that environment, right? So you don't want it to sound like you're in a studio when you're in the open, and you don't want it to sound like you're in the open when you're in a room or a closed environment. So for example, for a lot of these clips, I added a lot of reverb because of the openness. I also changed a lot of the clips to be a little bit more bass heavy, just so that they're not too studio sounding, because the higher pitch sometimes sounds like it's a little bit too close and a little bit too perfect. I just added a little bit more bass and lowered the pitch on some of the sounds. But you also want to lower the volume and adjust each sound effect accordingly to the video to make sure that it sounds in that environment, right? You don't want it to be too overpowering. And you also want to make sure that the sound sounds like it's coming from that direction. So for example, here where he's stepping and we're right above him, the steps are quieter. And obviously nobody knew this, but as he comes closer, the steps get louder. This is the loudest step here with branches breaking and shit. And then it gets a little bit quieter, it gets louder and all that stuff. So you want to make sure that the sounds kind of their volume and the way that they're not performed, but the way that they hit the person and hit your ear sounds like it actually is coming from that direction, right? Similar to this drone clip here. I have the sound effects of him walking, but they're very quiet. Like you can slightly hear it. And then when it gets back to this shot, you can hear it, right? And again, here I'm on grass. So I added the grass foot sound effect. At this point, here, he's on gravel, right? You can hear the rocks. So I added different rocks kicking noises. You want to make sure that the sound effects you add are what you actually see and what they would actually sound like, and change them based upon their environment, right? So you could see all these sound effects have some sort of like, something's been done to them, whether it's the volume that's been changed or I've added a pitch shifter or whatever it may be. Almost none of these sound effects, except like a few of them, are just stock the way that they came out of the sound pack. They're all adjusted some way in volume or wherever it may be to make it fit the exact composition that we're looking for. And that even can go into other things, right? So if you hear a sound that's on your left, you can make it so that you only hear it through the left speaker or the left earphone. Same thing with the right, same thing with the middle or behind you, and all these different things, right? You want to make sure that you change and add effects to the sound to make it feel like it's actually there, right? You don't want it to sound too monotone. A good example of that is I used to do a lot of barbershop videos, and what I've noticed is sometimes when people do barbershop videos nowadays, they'll add the clipper sound effect, like the and it'll be just way too loud and too intense, where it just doesn't sound like that when you're in person, right? You have to hear it a little bit quieter. It's not like you filmed it in your studio. The other thing that people don't do when they add the clipper sound effect is they don't add like the up and down motion, right? So when you're using a clipper, you see the barber using the clipper, you hear as it's going up and down. So what I would do in my barbershop videos is I would adjust the volume to go up and down to get that noise, and it fits even more into the video. And obviously you time it to the visuals to make sure that it fits well, either if you're slowing the clip down or whatever it might be, but you gotta add those extra little steps to make it even more immersive. Back at the barbershop example, same thing with the scissor clips that a lot of people add too. They're just too distinctive, right? Like if I'm like shooting at 40 millimeters and the person and I'm moving and all that, the scissor is not gonna sound like it would sound like if I'm in an empty room. It would sound a little bit muffled. You would hear the hint of a scissor, especially even in the barbershop. So it doesn't need to be very loud and overwhelming so that it's obvious. It just needs to fit the composition and the scene. So this brings us to our third and last tip, which is don't overdo sound design, right? I know I've said, yeah, add as much sound design as you possibly can, add all this, but remember, sound shapes the environment that we're in. So if you add too much of it, it can get too confusing and too intense. It's the example of if you have a pizza, right? Everybody wants a ton of toppings on the pizza, but the moment you add like 8 toppings or 10 toppings, you don't really even taste any topping specifically. The pizza doesn't have a mood essentially, right? Like if you have a meat pizza, or if you have a vegetarian pizza or Greek pizza or wherever it might be, that pizza is designed specifically to give you a savory, sweet, whatever taste it might be. But the moment that on a meat pizza, you start adding vegetables and feta and cheddar and all that, it doesn't taste the way it's supposed to. And it just tastes like a clusterfuck in your mouth. And you're not distinctive. It's not differentiating in any factor. So don't overdo sound effects, right? You gotta essentially not be afraid to have emptiness within the video. Sometimes it's good to have emptiness to kind of set that mood and to let it linger. You shouldn't be afraid to let clips linger. Don't be afraid that, oh yeah, nobody's gonna watch this if it's not a little bit faster, if it's not like this, or if it's not like that. Let it like run through a little bit. Hold that clip, hold that sound effect. It would add to the video. You don't always need to have it just like one after the other constantly. In the inverse, sometimes a lot of people hold video clips and all that shit way too long, and they do need to speed it up and change the tempo, but it's all different, right? Like it all fits to the mood that you're trying to do. There's nothing wrong with adding too many sounds here and there, but it can just take away from the mood that you're adding in. If your mood is clusterfuck and you're just trying to make it really intense, then yeah, add all those sound effects and make it feel like that. But if your mood is like eerie and you're trying to like leave suspense and, you know, build up like the mood, then you don't need all those sound effects. You need to be very, very specific in which ones you want to use to kind of create that mood and shape the environment. So yeah, for the most part, if you're not adding sound to your videos, you definitely have to start adding them because it's such a crucial part to the video. But just make sure you keep those 3 tips in mind when you do sound design. That way you're able to keep it a little bit more tame and immersive for the viewer, and you're not gonna overdo it too much, but just make sure that you're getting the most out of your immersive experience, if that makes sense, right? Because like I said a few times throughout the video, sound shapes the environment around us. So use it to your advantage. Let it shape the mood of your video and create the atmosphere that you're looking for. Otherwise, that's it for me today, ladies and gentlemen. I really hope that you learned something. If you did, put it in the comment section below. I'd love to have a conversation with you guys and go back and forth on different tips on sound design that you may have that I may or may not have missed in this video. Otherwise, leave a like if you like the video, subscribe if you're new. It's your boy Krisztian Kadar, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace!